Have you ever tried a headset before? If you have, I'm guessing it was comfortable, right? I mean, you definitely didn't have to deal with a huge cinder block on your head. Turns out, neither did the users of the first head-mounted display. Yeah, for something made in the 60s, it actually looked normal. Hello and welcome to Point of View. I'm your host Massimo, and I'll be taking you through the past, present, and future of virtual reality. In this episode, we're going to look at the first headsets, like real working ones attached to computers. Even though the first headset looked a lot like the ones today, it lacked a lot of the features and capabilities that we're used to when using VR. It all started in 1960 when a familiar name came back into the picture. It was the 1960s and technology was booming after the Second World War had ended. TVs, radios, and even computers were becoming more popular by the day. Soon, VR headsets would be the next item on that list. You remember Morton Heilig, right? The guy who made that weird arcade cabinet showing people a bike ride through Brooklyn? Yeah, that was a weird invention. I mean, it was cool and all, but definitely not one you'd see being sold in stores. Despite his lack of success, Morton wasn't done. He wanted to go further with virtual reality. He wanted people to be able to watch things without having to squeeze their heads into a giant box, even though it meant losing the full experience of stimulating all five senses. In 1960, Morton created the first ever head-mounted display, or HMD for short, called the Telesphere Mask. It didn't include any virtual reality, but it was similar to the Sensorama. It featured stereoscopic 3D images and sound, but lacked motion tracking, making the first-person view a little bit off. So imagine you're watching something through a VR headset and the picture just stays in one spot. The picture didn't move where you moved. It was stuck in a fixed position. But luckily it wasn't too long until two engineers made a new prototype of the Telesphere Mask. In 1961, two engineers named Como and Bryan created the HeadSight. This was essentially the better Telesphere Mask because it included motion tracking. This basically meant that images moved with the user when they moved, all thanks to a magnetic motion tracking system and a video screen for left and right eyes. It wasn't a huge improvement, but it did catch the eyes of the US military. Now, we all know they loved flight simulators, after all the Link Trainer was made of course, but these headsets made pilot training even better, allowing pilots to view dangerous situations in certain areas via remote. It looked like VR was becoming a lot more common to the average person and not just the lab rats and science experiments. But how common was it? This question led to a crazy idea made by a man named Ivan Sutherland, a computer scientist who believed that VR could be so realistic that people couldn't be able to tell the difference between a simulation and reality, kind of like The Matrix. In 1965, Sutherland conceptualized this idea and called it the ultimate display. He made a prediction that we would eventually be able to wander freely in a computer-generated world, one that would update in real time and allow us to interact with virtual objects in a realistic way. Even though technology was far from this reality in the mid-60s, it served as a blueprint for making virtual worlds like the metaverse, which we're not too far away from getting our hands on today, but we got a lot of ground to cover before that. Now, it's time we look at the first head-mounted display with VR, the one that seemingly started it all. It was 1968 and Ivan Sutherland was back, this time with his student apprentice Bob Sproul. He was less focused on his dystopian sci-fi theory and decided to create something people could actually get their heads into. Together with his apprentice, the two scientists created the first ever head-mounted display to actually use VR. And they called it, wait for it, the Sword of Damocles. Really, that was the name. It sounded like something out of Dungeons & Dragons. Pretty unusual compared to the rest, but it was groundbreaking. This is because the head mount was connected to a computer and not a camera, allowing virtual images to be generated and displayed to the user instead of pictures. But let's not praise this thing too much. It was far from perfect. The main problem was images were very basic and sometimes hard to make out because they were wireframe pictures. So think of like a 3D cube you draw in your notebook in class or a pyramid you draw in geometry. Yeah, that level of basic. It's also worth mentioning that the device was held from the ceiling since it was so heavy that it couldn't even be placed on a human head. It looked like a mix between the vision test machine at the eye doctor's office and an evil villain's latest torture device. But hey, it was a start. Unfortunately, headsets didn't really get much attention after the Sword of Damocles. The 70s were filled with artificial reality, a bizarre moment in time when people were introduced to dark rooms filled with projectors, shooting computer-generated images at them, and a virtual tour map that basically served as the first ever Google Maps. The headset didn't really see a return until the 80s. But at the same time, another item came into the market and turned everyone's heads around. Scientists got thinking about how users could immerse themselves into a virtual space and interact with it at the same time. Their solution? The glove. I know it sounds way different from what we've been talking about, but I'll get a grip on it later. Strap into the final episode where I take you through the glove craze of the 1980s, the VR video game war of the 90s, and the new millennium of the biggest virtual innovations known to date. Once again, I'm Massimo, and thanks for tuning in to Point of View. Until next time.